My kids love hide and go seek. While my 8 and 6-year-olds are accomplished hiders and seekers, my 4-year-old has this habit of attempting to hide in plain sight. As the count nears its conclusion, he panics when he hasn't found a hiding spot. So he stops and stands statue-like in the middle of the room with his eyes closed. In his mind, if he can't see you, you can't see him. Well, you could say he's mastered the art of hiding in plain sight, maybe mastered it. I perceive similarities in the church in America. We have our own habits of hiding, and this has nothing to do with COVID. Quarantining because of a virus is understandable, and this gut punch is not about that. You see, well before COVID was ever an issue, the church was in hiding, missing in action, so to speak. In the South, you can't go far without seeing a church. Yet while our church buildings impact and adorn the cultural landscape, our church people have failed to impact and adorn the cultural ethos. We have mastered the art of hiding in plain sight. In Judges chapter 6, the people of God are hiding. Having lost the protection of God because of their rebellion, for 7 years they lived under the oppressive hand of the Midianites. They were beaten down and had stopped fighting altogether, resolved to live out their days under the backbreaking tyranny of the godless around them. While there are many disheartening elements of this sad state of affairs, perhaps the saddest was that this was not what God had intended for His people. The people that God had redeemed from 400 years of Egyptian bondage. The people that had seen God part the water so they could walk through on dry land. The people that had experienced God's continuous provision in the wilderness wanderings. The people that saw God conquer Jericho and other city-states through His miraculous intercession. These same people now cowered in fear, hiding for their lives and eking out a meager and pitiful existence in caves. What happened to them? They forgot God. I don't mean that they had a lapse in cerebral activity resulting in failure to properly identify and follow God. They had a lapse in spiritual activity resulting in failure to properly identify and follow God. Simply put, they failed to live out the words to that popular hymn. They failed to trust and obey. Along the way, they failed to walk with God, failed to remember all that God had done for them, failed to live up to God's desires and follow God's direction. You see, God told them when they entered the promised land to clear out the godless and to establish a kingdom of God followers, loyal only to Him as King. He promised that if they trusted and obeyed Him, they would enjoy the riches of the land flowing with milk and honey. But following Him meant that they would have to fight, a charge they simply weren't interested in heeding. They were excited about the promised land and they wanted to enjoy the riches of God's blessings in that land. However, they had no desire to fight for it. Even though God had promised His presence and power in and through them in such a way that they could not lose, they ended up missing out on the fullness of His bounty because they weren't willing to see God's power unleashed through them. Consequently, they squandered the opportunity to plant God's flag completely and fully throughout the land. And in so doing, they squandered the opportunity to fully experience the abundance of the land, settling to share it with the ungodly. Thus, we find them in Judges 6, oppressed and beaten down, hiding out, having missed the opportunity for absolute rest and peace. The church was commissioned by Jesus Himself to go into the world of the godless and to plant His flag, laying claim to the earth under His banner and lordship. And we have failed in this task. Like the Israelites of old, we have wanted to enjoy the riches of God's blessings in the land, but we have been unwilling to see God's power unleashed through us to accomplish the task. We have been eager to bask under the shade tree of God's bounty, but unwilling to chop down the trees of idolatry and godlessness that have grown around us to crowd out God's activity. We have cloistered ourselves into religious enclaves, squabbling over scraps from the secular world. Although our buildings are visible, our impact is minimal. But there's hope. Our God is a gracious God. In Judges 6, God comes to an unsuspecting hider named Gideon. Seemingly a coward in disguise, God indicates that he was actually a mighty warrior masquerading as a coward. It seemed that God knew there was more in Gideon than even Gideon knew. God was tired of His people hiding, and God called this warrior to stop hiding and to take his place on the battlefield to make a difference for the kingdom of God. And make a difference Gideon did. You know the story. In the same way, God is speaking to His people today, calling us out of hiding and reminding us that greater is He that is in us than he that is in the world. We follow a God who didn't hide. He revealed himself to the world, and our deliverer came seeking to save the lost. We as his people need to stop hiding. We need to follow him in the mission of seeking. No more hiding in plain sight, church. Let's get busy seeking the lost. This has been your spiritual gut punch for the week.